This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome public theologian, writer, blogger, and podcaster Kat Armas. We'll discuss her upcoming book, Abuelita Faith.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And you have entered into the Vicar's Crossing podcast with two vicars and our digital deacon. So let us introduce ourselves today. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
Spent some time in the parking lot there yesterday watching your guy change the sign, actually.
Oh, good for you.
I found that very entertaining. But
oh, yeah, the whole neighborhood comes out for that.
Well, yeah, I just thought I'd let you know. I was over there and I needed a spot to take a call, and I pulled in, and this guy came, pulled the sign in. He was sliding letters all over. It was incredible. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I'm Kevin George, and I'm the priest at St. Aidan's Church on Oxford Street West, hanging out here for a bit, and I'm glad to be with you with my digital deacon friend.
And my name is Ian. I'm a singer, songwriter, producer guy. That's my official title, by the way. I bring this podcast to the world.
All right.
I'm the messenger. I'm like
He's
Hermes.
He's the man. Who?
Hermes.
What? Hermes.
God
okay.
of,
Hermes.
Yeah,
sorry.
Hermes.
Sorry.
Okay.
I heard something else.
Careful.
Okay.
Guys, we got a great guest today. We will be welcoming into the Vicar's Crossing a lady by the name of Kat Armas, who we have yet to meet. We will be meeting today. And Kat has written a book, and it looks like this. Yep. And it is called Abuelita Faith.
Yes.
And Abuelita, what women on the margins teach us about wisdom, persistence, and strength. And it's a wonderful book.
And you know what? They're not even out yet. And look at us. We're holding copies.
We got these advanced copies, huh?
We do.
Pretty lucky. So we'll be chatting with Kat coming up in just a little bit.
Before we do any of that, Rob, let's acknowledge that the land we record this podcast on is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenawayapuck, and Attawandaron peoples, and is connected with the London Township and Somber treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse and indigenous peoples, our First Nation, our Métis, and our Inuit, and we recognize them as contemporary stewards of this land and commit to working together with them towards reconciliation. And we as a nation continue, and as a people, continue to sort of grieve and mourn with that community as we continue to come to grips with the loss of life and a revelation of those bodies in Kamloops, BC, and to do what we can to work towards justice for that.
Okay, good. Thank you. Also, thank you and hello to our good friends, our sponsors here at the Vicar's Crossing, such great partners with us here and give us the ability to do this every week with you. First, hello and thank you to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And our thanks to Dave Mullen and his staff at A. Miller George today.
Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. I have to say, if I was doing this podcast yesterday instead of today, you would not understand me because I was sneezing, hacking, coughing, and oozing stuff out of my eyes because of the allergies are really bad. Yeah. But I went to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy after a call to my doctor, and Carol Basada, the owner-operator there of this locally owned, locally operated, locally loved institution, gave me the stuff to make me my suave, beautiful, debonair, and well-sounding self coming to you today. So thank you, Carol, for all you do.
And last but certainly not least, we want to say a special thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Trisha Lister hooked us up with that one. You got sneeze gunk everywhere? Ring them up.
Well, I got to tell you, Molly Maid never made it to your room. Is all I'm saying.
Hey, well,
Because I saw you cleaning up before the podcast. So
that's
Anyway.
cleaned up back there.
yeah, it is. Yeah,
Not
believe it or
yet.
not.
Smokes.
Hey,
All
listen,
right.
guys.
one thing at a time. One thing at a time.
Guys, this is a really hard week here in London, Ontario. I think we start by acknowledging where we're at. If you're listening to this, we're recording on a Wednesday.
Tuesday.
On a Tuesday. I'll be
Today's
okay.
Tuesday.
Today is Tuesday, COVID. And we learned on Sunday that there was a terrible collision on Hyde Park Road here in London, just not far from this church. And on Monday, we learned that it wasn't just an accident. It was an act of terror where 3 generations of a family, 4 out of 5 killed by an act of terror, by an act of hate, because this family were Muslim. So we want to extend our prayers and best wishes to the family and to the entire Muslim community. Tonight, there is a vigil. So by the time you listen to this, this will have happened at the London Muslim Mosque. But if you're available on Friday, you can join us at the site of that crime, which is the corner of South Carriage Drive and Hyde Park Road, and we will walk the 7 kilometers down Hyde Park Road to Oxford Street and down Oxford Street to the London Muslim Mosque, where we'll arrive at 8:45 to commemorate the time of that tragedy. And we're going to be joined by our mayor, our elected officials, our Bishop Taub will be there, many of our clergy will be there, faith leaders across denominations, across faiths, rabbis and imams and leaders in the Sikh and Hindu community have committed to coming. People from our First Nations community. I just got off the phone with Black Lives Matter. They intend to be there in force as well. So please, if you're in the London area listening to this, come and join us on Friday night as a show of solidarity. We're going to come out in numbers to say that love will overwhelm hate. I don't know what to say, Rob. My heart breaks over this.
I'm having trouble finding the words the last 48 hours or so since this happened, and I'm learning I'm not alone. There's a lot of silence, which is okay too.
Yeah.
I mean, sitting in this right now, it's still very raw and fresh, and but like Kevin said, if you're available to, and maybe you don't know what to say, you don't know where you're at, and you want to come Friday just to show and be present and show a state of solidarity with our Muslim neighbors, please do that if you can. It starts at 7. I know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but if people don't feel they can walk that distance or take part in the whole thing, if they want to join somewhere in the route and just walk a bit or stand and be together, that's the main thing.
There's all kinds of access points along the way. For those who are here in London, you'll be familiar with sort of the London Mall, which is at Oxford and Wonderland. Anywhere, Cherry Hill Mall, anywhere at the corner. Some folks are gathering here at St. Aidan's, which is just on the corner of Hyde Park and Oxford, and are going to walk the short distance to Hyde Park to meet up. So anywhere along that route, you'll be able to join us for a shorter distance. So,
and if you can't, and you're the praying type, by all means, hold us in prayer at 7 o'clock Friday night. I mean, please do that.
All the information is on the socials for St. Aidan's Church, but it's an interfaith event. It's just that we used our platform. And I'm talking to a certain digital guy I know, and the hope is that the beginning and the end of the event will be live streamed on all our platforms, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. So look for that anywhere from sort of 6:45 on, and then it'll pick up again at sort of 7:40. 8:40 on to about 9 o'clock. So
okay, very good.
What's terrifying about that is the person who was driving the vehicle and committed the act. That is they're around my age,
same age, 20.
It's shocking that it's upset. I don't have any words for it, but just I'm that age.
How does anybody learn that much hate by your age?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't.
Yeah.
That's horrible, really.
It is unfathomable, and
and
right now we can be together in this and support those that are in pain, and we'll walk together this week. Well, guys, before we bring Kat in, Kat Armas is our guest, and Abwali to Faith is the book today we're going to be talking about. It's time for us to play a quick edition of our new game here on the Vickers Crossing, which we like to call...
Remember, it It's not a lie if you believe it.
Ah,
No.
it's not a
No,
lie
it's
if you
not.
believe it.
No, it's not.
What is
So-
this, Rob? We're
Well,
playing like
yeah, because it's not a lie if you can convince yourself of it, I guess, according to George Costanza. But what we're going to do is Kevin today is going to tell a story about himself or his life,
Mhm.
and Ian and I are going to try to figure out if it is a lie or if it is
Mhm.
not true.
Mhm.
And Kevin believes that I guess it's true, but we're going to have to decipher this, Ian. So we'll let Kevin tell a story here.
Okay, so this actually goes back to my favorite sport, which is hockey. Which I just got to say, since we last recorded,
Yes.
Montreal began and ended a playoff series.
Yeah, what a sweep.
Ole. So I have made many pilgrimages to Montreal to go to the Bell Center to watch the Montreal Canadiens play. Seen a few games there. It's an incredible place. It vibrates. It's unlike Toronto, where when you go, it's like being at the opera, because everybody there is in their suits with their cufflinks and they're all very polite. There's not a lot of noise. The Bell Center vibrates. It's amazing. So on one of our trips, when we were sitting at breakfast, it was back when PK Subban was playing with the Montreal Canadiens. Into his favorite, we went there because it's his favorite breakfast place. Into the breakfast place came PK Subban, and I approached him and I asked him would he sit and have a coffee with us, and he did. And we chatted about the future and about how excited he was to be in Montreal and all that stuff. And then in that off season, boom, they traded him. And
I was going to say they traded him the next day.
So, but we had a grand chat over a coffee at what is it called? I think it's called Excellent or Eggtastic or Egg Exceptional or something like that.
Yeah.
It's got egg in the title.
Oh, okay.
There's a place like that in Toronto, right?
Yeah. It's a
Yeah.
part of a
Yeah.
chain, but there's a owner in Montreal that he's close with, I guess, and that's where he likes to go for breakfast. And that's
Great
where we
place.
had a coffee and talked about the future.
So what did you have for breakfast that day?
I had an omelet,
Yeah,
Western omelet,
Western omelet.
Yeah.
Okay.
my go-to for omelets.
All right, Ian, what do you think? Is Kevin making this up, or is that a true story?
I don't think it's impossible to happen. I just feel like I would have seen a photo of it. Like I feel like Kevin's the type of person to be like, I have to like
Unless
capture this
PK
moment.
is not
Yeah.
into getting his picture taken.
Okay, fair. But I don't know PK, but I know you. So you know what? I'm gonna go against my gut. I'm gonna say that this is true.
Okay, this
I'm
is
gonna
true.
say that you are telling the
It's true.
truth.
Okay.
I believe it.
This is
All
true.
right,
What do you
so
say,
one true.
Robbie?
I feel like we've been playing this game for a while now. I feel it's one of these half-true stories. I think
Okay.
you were in the restaurant. I think you did have an omelet. I'm sure that PK might have walked by. I would have heard a story before.
He
you
might have
telling
been
me that
there. He might have been there
might
at
have
some
been
point
there
in his life.
earlier. Yeah, might have left his wallet there, and you found it.
Like
Okay,
I do.
but I don't know. Yeah, I agree with Ian too that you would have had that all over social media and stuff. So
Okay.
I'm thinking that while you were there, I don't think you actually sat down, talked about PK, and gave him the curse of Kevin, and he got traded later. So I'll say it's a half lie.
Okay, well, I mean, it's really truly entirely a lie. I mean, I have had breakfast at a restaurant in Montreal while being up there to see a hockey game, but the rest of that is fictional. I mean,
That's right.
I
Should have
or
gone with my
fictitional,
gut.
fictitious,
Yeah.
not fictional,
Yeah.
fictitious. And so, yeah, I mean, I did eat breakfast in Montreal once.
Nice.
Much is true.
Yeah. And PK's picture was on the wall. So
PK Subban did play.
Kevin had this vision and dream of having breakfast.
PK
with
Subban did play hockey in Montreal and probably
Yes.
ate breakfast in
Yeah.
Montreal in a restaurant somewhere too.
Okay, fair enough.
But we
All right.
didn't cross paths.
That's another edition of It's Not a Lie
If you believe it. That's
And
it.
we'll have another story next time on the Vickers Crossing. Shall we get Kat in here and let's talk to her, and
Let's
looking
do
forward to chatting a little bit about her new book. Here's Kat.
Awesomeness. Let's get Kat.
And here she is on to the Vickers Crossing for the very first time, and we hope it will be the last time. We want to welcome Kat Armas to the Vickers Crossing today. How are you, Kat?
I'm doing well. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Great. Now tell our listeners where you are so we can kind of zero in on the geography.
Yeah, so I'm actually in Nashville, Tennessee right now. I moved here fairly recently, about 2 months ago. So
Okay.
haven't been here long. Moved here from Los Angeles. Before
Oof.
that, I was in New Orleans, and
Oof.
then I'm
Wow.
from Miami. So I have been
All
doing a
over.
lot of,
Yeah.
yeah,
So this is about as far north as you've gone then.
yeah, it
Nashville.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Wow.
creeping up to the Canadian border here, you
Yeah,
know.
I think we could.
Yeah.
I think we could probably get there in about 10 hours in the car, Rob.
Yeah,
We
we
could hit
could
Nashville.
do
Oh,
that.
that's not
Yeah,
bad.
Yeah, it's not too
Not bad
bad.
at all.
We're
Yeah.
about 2 hours west of Toronto here in a place called London, Ontario. The other London.
Awesome.
We've been voted
Yeah,
the
not
second
crazy.
most interesting London for 170 years. So
I love that.
So Kat's book is this book here. We're going to talk about that and some other things today. And so we've been joking about how we're going to pronounce all these Spanish words today. So this is our
Abuelita.
first crack at Abuelita.
Good job.
Is that
That's
it?
great.
We were doing
You guys got it.
Abuelita. Perfect.
Yeah.
Abuelita faith. What women on the margins teach us about wisdom, persistence, and strength. So happy to have you here to chat about this today.
it's coming to a bookstore near you on August 10th, or you can pre-order it now on Amazon, Chapters here in Canada, or any online bookseller. Obviously, we're always big here about encouraging you to go to your local booksellers. So here in London, check out Oxford Books and tell them you'd like to pre-order this thing there. Make sure they get it in when it's ready. Kat, I thought we'd begin by letting listeners know a little bit more about you, about yourself, your faith journey, and what kind of holy mischief you're up to. As Shane Claiborne likes to say, holy mischief. And having read your book, I can tell that you like holy mischief too. And it's a good thing. So tell us a little bit about you, about your background and this journey of faith that you're on.
Yeah. Well, I am, let's see, like I said, I'm from Miami. I'm Cuban American,
Mhm.
and I was raised Roman Catholic. And so I think that is, those are very specific things to my background and my upbringing. And I wasn't introduced, I guess you can say, to evangelicalism until I was older, in my early 20s. I was still young, but I wasn't a child. And so I think that was a very unique experience, because it was leaving my little Cuban haven of Miami, which is very Cuban. I don't know if you guys have visited Miami, but yeah, they call it like the Latin America of, the US, because you speak Spanish like everywhere, and it's just very Cuban. So yeah, I was part of the dominant culture growing up, because of that, right? And it wasn't until I sort of left and I realized, oh, it's not like this, in the rest of the United States. So that was very shocking for me, particularly coming from an immigrant Roman Catholic community, and then being introduced to white evangelicalism, something that I hadn't previously had experience in or with. So it was a big culture shock, being raised by a single grandmother and a single mother, and all of a sudden being introduced to, well, this is how a family is supposed to function, and
Right.
this is how the nuclear, and having women really be the ones to provide and influence me and all of these things, but then being told that, well, no, it's supposed to be the man, or and so it was very different from my lived reality and my lived experiences, and how quote unquote it was supposed to be, or I was I was supposed to look, as far as faith and spirituality and the outworkings of that, right?
Right.
So then that's where I sort of I began unraveling, and just thinking like, well, where do I belong in this Christianity thing? In this evangelical space, do I even belong here? Is this even for me?
Right.
And then, I've always had a passion for the Bible, and as soon as I, really started digging into it, because I found it so fascinating and so interesting, and there was so many stories as I'm reading through it, of just survival, right? There's stories of women doing, scandalous things to survive.
Yeah.
And as I began, looking into this, I realized, wait a minute, this is the story of my grandmother, and this is my family story, and this is the story of the immigrant community from which I am a part of.
Right.
So much of faith and spirituality looks like survival, right? And when you see that in scripture, God's not intimidated by that. Like, God blesses that, and God is in the midst of that. And so that's when I just began sort of unraveling and re-raveling, right? And just sort of, if that's even a word, but I just sort of began putting those pieces together and just looking for more inclusive spaces for myself, but also ways to understand the divine. And that's sort of where I'm at. I feel like my faith is constantly evolving and changing and shifting and transforming in the best way, right? Of course, there are hardships in that, but it's a beautiful journey. So that's sort of where I'm at now. I do have a love for the academy. I do have a love for heady intellectual stuff, which is funny because my book is like, no, that's not.
I know your book is the opposite of that. Yeah.
Right. So and that's sort of me just wrestling within myself, right? Of, trying to tie in the intellectual stuff with the embodied stuff, right? So yeah, that's a little bit about my journey.
That's really cool, actually. And I was thinking as I was reading your book too, that we had Yolanda Pierce on here not very long ago, and her book is in my grandmother's house, right? Which I found I was thinking back to that as I was reading about your own grandmother and about your own experiences, and it's very clear to me, as outlined in the book, that the application of what you've learned from your family and largely from women is influenced who you are today. And I hear it in your podcast. And one of my favorite podcasts to listen to is your podcast. And so I'd encourage people to go listen to it. It's, wait for it, here's another moment of Anglo white guy trying to say a Spanish word. And not only that, a Newfoundlander who can't even speak proper English is going to attempt to say a Spanish word, protagonistas.
Perfect. You got it.
That's the name of the podcast, and it is really superior. The guests you've had are fantastic. It's a lot of we talk about intersection with faith in the public square on the Vickers Crossing, but a lot of conversation about intersectionality between race, gender, faith, and all that. So maybe tell folks more about your podcast, about why you like doing it, who's on there, and your hopes for it, your dreams for it, because it's a beautiful podcast.
Thank you so much. That really means so much to me. So it's funny. I started the Protagonistas several years ago, and it was I originally wanted to do like a 10-part miniseries. Like I was like, hey, as I was thinking about this book and I was beginning to, I was dreaming about it and beginning to start, putting some chapters together and things like that. And it sort of just went with it. Like, wait, there are, so many women of color who are doing seemingly normal, quote unquote, unextraordinary things, but they are extraordinary. And we don't hear from them very often. I had, sort of recently broken off of this very, very white evangelical space. And I realized, man, I was just really hungry to learn from more women and more women of color. And so I thought, and there's, there wasn't many podcasts back then. Well, there were, but not many, focusing on by women of color, for women of color.
Right.
And I
Joe Rogan,
like,
I got to say, sorry to interrupt. Joe Rogan doesn't talk about this stuff.
Right. Exactly. So I thought, let me just talk to like 10 women. Maybe.
I don't know.
So I thought, let me just talk to like 10 women and just, but people started listening, right? And people were like, hey, this is great. Can we hear more? And so, but it was funny because I don't have no experience with podcasting. So I was like, people would send me comments like, I love your podcast, but the audio is terrible. Can you fix it? And I'm like, yeah. And people were like, talk to your audio guy. I'm like, sure, that's me.
That's Ian. We'll get a hold of Ian.
There you go. Yeah.
Literally though, like I'll help.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, not at all.
I've been able to connect, and kind of it's gotten a little better. But thank you. But yeah, so anyway, so my podcast is just that, right? Me just speaking to women, particularly women of color, Black, Indigenous, and other women of color, and just about their experiences. And something that I wanted to do was talk to everyday women. Of course, I have some who have larger platforms or who have written books, but I sort of just wanted to talk to, just the everyday person and how they're working through their faith. So yeah.
No, that's great.
I think that's probably oh, sorry, Rob. I was going to say, I think that's probably my favorite part of it, actually, is, I mean, the author's all that great, but the everyday people you're talking to, I listen to it, it's just fantastic. So keep it up. Great work.
Thank you.
That is gold for sure. It's and again, great book. Thank you for the advanced copy. And one of the book, I find it kind of explores the question, as you write, what if the greatest theologians the world has ever known are those whom the world wouldn't even consider theologians, right? Flipping
Yeah.
everything upside down. So first, can you tell people a little bit about, first of all, what is an when we use the word abuelita, and tell us about your abuela as well, who that is.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. So, yeah, that sort of like leading question is what I'm trying to get at, right? What if the greatest theologians the world has ever known are those whom the world wouldn't consider theologians? And I began pondering this as I was thinking about my grandmother, of course. But I was in seminary. I was receiving formal, quote unquote, formal theological education. I was learning from the quote unquote experts,
Right.
and I was sort of like, and like I said, it became a very intellectual and heady endeavor. But I felt so disconnected from God in many ways, because everything was a very intellectual endeavor. And I read in my book how it felt so fragmented, right? My identity, I began to feel so fragmented. And so, I just was thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, reading through the Bible and seeing how so much of it is survival, and thinking, wait, this is my family story, and connecting these things, and then thinking, wow, my grandmother would never be considered a theologian. She would never, she's never received formal education. She worked with her hands her whole life, right? She never led a Bible study. But she was committed to the church, and she was committed to her faith, and she was committed to her family and her community. And her life and her theology was embodied, right? Like I experienced God through the, when we sat around the dinner table and we talked about life in Cuba. And I experienced God as the black beans were simmering on the stove and the floor was being mopped. And I experienced God, as she taught me to stick a needle through the head of or stick the thread through the head of a needle, because she sewed and provided for our family. And yeah, and I saw these stories come alive in scripture, right? Like Tabitha, and how Tabitha, I love so much that, after she dies and she's called to be resurrected, right? Which I think is so fascinating. There's not many folks in the New Testament besides Jesus that are resurrected. And she's one of them. So that should, cause you to pause and sort of,
Right.
why her, But I love that we don't have that many details about Tabitha, except for the fact that she sewed, and the fact that she made clothes for the widows in her community. And that was so, that detail made it into the story, and that's what the widows were, talking about. Like that was how she showed her faith, or how she demonstrated her faith. And I'm like, that's my grandmother, like that's exactly her. Like maybe she couldn't, quote unquote, articulate all of these things about God, but she could sew something for someone who needed it, right? So I think that is sort of where I got this idea, like, what if the greatest theologians the world has ever known are those who are overlooked and unnamed, who are making the tunics, right? I think of the Canaanite woman, we love her story of her interacting with Jesus because Jesus calls her a dog, right? So every time we talk about her, it's about, well, what did Jesus mean? And was Jesus racist? And, all of these questions, but she gets overlooked in her own story. And I love that after she interacts with Jesus, he says, you have great faith. And this is right before or right after, I can't specifically remember, but right before he tells the disciples, you have no faith, so it's like he uplifts this woman who is overlooked, who would not be considered a theologian, as someone with extraordinary faith, right? And so I see that in so many overlooked women. My grandmother, who, she was just trying to survive too, just like the Canaanite woman. And no one would say, oh, woman, greatest theologian or woman of great faith. But she was, in how she lived her life, and it was embodied, and it was through, again, the use of her hands. So yeah, she was just an embodied woman, and it wasn't forced embodiment. It was just how she was, right? She wasn't thinking about how do I live an embodied faith today? No, it was just how she was. So yeah.
No, that's great. I love the way you were able to, hold that up and say that, by our culture's standards, they don't possess PhDs in prayer or how to interpret the Bible or do exegesis, one of those fancy words that we like to throw around.
It's a great word.
Right? They might have,
exegesis.
they're not ordained and that kind of stuff, but they've been playing these roles forever and called by God. And I really resonated with me because I shared this with the guys before, that I lived and was very close to my great grandmother when I was doing my undergrad. And she was in her mid 90s when I was living with her, and she was still at home. and not understanding it at the time, of course, because
Right.
I was more worried and doing things that 19-year-old guys are worried about doing
Right.
than listening and watching. But looking back on it, I learned a lot about faith and the embodiment of the love of God through the life that she shared with me and the stories that she shared. And
Right.
when I look back on that, it really is that connection, and it embodied that as well. Was there a time when you can think back when you were little and maybe you didn't recognize it at the time, but you look back on it and say, wait a minute, that's exactly what I'm learning in theology school and all that, and it kind of maybe perked your interest a little bit?
Yeah, so much. And I resonate with what you said of how, when you're young, you don't realize or you don't notice. And I like to
Yeah.
say that, we don't recognize how survival is sacred until we have to start surviving. We grow up and have to start surviving
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, and then we're like, oh, wait a minute, this journey of survival is sacred. This journey of figuring it out and seeing how God is so intertwined in that is sacred, right? Is holy. And that's something that I try and communicate in my book. Like, the journey is holy and sacred. You don't have to do these things that dominant culture says you have to do in order, to make it holy and sacred. God is in the midst of that. And so, yeah, there were so many moments with my grandmother. I would think, now looking back, how she came alive in her garden. I know that I write a little bit about that toward the end of my book, but I think for me, it was so meaningful because to this day, she has dementia now. And so we don't really know, like, as far as her memory, we don't really know what she remembers or what little memory is going to bubble up. But she talks so much of her island, right, of Cuba, and she is just still so in love. And she'll say, I've been in this country she doesn't speak a word of English, but she'll say, I've been in this country for 50 years and my bones will be buried in a place that's not my home, and her home is her island. And, that was something that now, as I was studying just colonization and, these sort of realities and realizing, I write about it in the beginning of my book, but, how that, distorted the relationship between land and between people and between, and how land is sacred and land is holy. And we see that so much in the Bible, right? Israel and how they're so deeply wanting to be restored in their land, right? And so I see this so much in my grandmother and how, land for her is life. And she experienced God so much in her garden and when her hands were in the dirt and in the avocado tree and in the mango trees. And, that's something that as a kid, I just loved to hang out there with her, but I didn't realize that also was sacred. Those moments were sacred. And it was more so, we would pick fruit and we would bring it, indoors and eat it for snack, and how life was so intertwined and life was so interconnected. And she would thank God and praise God as she did those things, right? Like that, those were sacred moments.
Yeah,
And
like
she
holy meals, right? You're
right,
experiencing and having holy meals
right.
in those
Yes.
moments. And
Yes. I
It's
love that.
incredible. Margaret Atwood is a Canadian author, and one of the things she said was that in the spring we should smell like dirt.
It's beautiful.
And I think as I was reading about your grandmother in the garden, I like Rob, I drawn back to my own grandmother, but I just think we've lost some of that. I think that we've
Right.
lost our connection to the earth.
Yeah.
And we our sort of urbanization and our
Right.
sort of cosmopolitan way is sort of, things are
Yeah.
disconnected from creation.
Right.
And I was just drawn to that as you wrote about it. But on to another matter. We don't often make international news here in Canada unless we've won a gold medal or something like that in hocky, but sorry about your Nashville Predators, by the way. But anyway,
Oh, yeah.
that's like the Nashville what? I don't know. But
Yeah. I actually did hear about that, so I was able to connect it.
So you do. And she just moved to Nashville, so
Right.
I did that. So, okay.
Right.
So
right.
no, I wasn't meaning to say you wouldn't know about hockey. I was just like,
No,
you're new
don't
to
worry.
Nashville. But we have made international news for all the wrong reasons here in this last
Right.
week or so in Canada. We've shifted to the front page. We can be pretty self-righteous in this country and smug about, particularly as it relates to race relationships. And we like to look at the problems in the United States and say, oh, look, they should get their act together. And
Well, we should, but
yeah, well, yeah, but we
Yeah.
very quickly sort of get distracted from what's going on right here in our own backyard. This last week has really been a gut punch for everybody, particularly here in the city of London.
Yeah.
The news out of Kamloops, British Columbia, is very difficult. we've discovered 215 bodies of children who were buried on the site of former residential school. And here in London, actually just about 2 kilometers from here or a mile and a half, however you translate that, on Hyde Park Road, there was an act of terror where a 20-year-old man, as an act of hate, ran over a family of 5, killing 4 in 3 generations, Muslim family. And this news became public yesterday, and we're all reeling from it here. And as we're talking, my phone's lighting up because there's a march plan that we're involved in planning and so on. So things have been going crazy. So I want to pick up on that story of the 215 kids and ask you a question because, and I think you saw I tweeted about this, and that I picked up your book to read it right as that news was breaking. And I couldn't help but have strike me right between the eyes the sort of very first paragraph of your book where you write about being on your bed doing your research, and you share these words. It wasn't the first time I'd felt the pangs that come when the past reveals itself to you, when an unknown history digs itself up from the grave. Colonizer or colonized, oppressor or oppressed, there's a moment after the deep, dark, often lonely work of becoming our own archaeologist that the pangs hit. It's a surprising pain that often comes when we dig up the skeletons from the ground, when we realize the dirt we stand on is tainted and the reality that we've been fed is curated. With apologies to the publisher for quoting, because I said on the book not to quote it without permission. I thought, shit, I quoted it without permission.
I think you're okay.
So, but that really struck me, Kat, because the ground, the reality that we've been fed has been curated. The ground on which we stand is tainted. And given what we're dealing with here in Canada, what we know is that probably, there are tens of thousands of these children buried across this country. In the Anglican Church here in Canada, we have Archbishop Mark MacDonald, who, when he was on this podcast about 8-9 months ago, said that when he first entered into his position, one of the first things they did when he toured former residential schools was they toured him to the cemeteries on the school lots. Now, he said, stop and think about that for a second. I mean, schools have playgrounds, not cemeteries. Why does a school have a cemetery? And the history of the Cuban people and colonization as well with Spaniards and so on, there are these crossovers. And so I just wonder if you write about your life and about generational memory, which I think is so critically important. A lot of what we deal with in Canada right now is generational grief and generational pain. So I wonder if you can share a little bit about the sorrow you feel for a time that's deep in the past, a generational grief. While you were born in Miami, sitting with your abuelita or your abuela, you're hearing the story of who you are. It's in you. Right. So I wonder if you can talk about that, because I think for listeners here in Canada, as it relates to the residential schools and our Indigenous and First Nations friends and siblings, it's so critically important. So share with us some of that, if you would.
Yeah, no, thank you. Actually, when I saw that you sort of made that connection, that was really moving for me. Because of course you never know what's going to happen in the world and how your words are going to be, what weight they'll sort of carry in different moments. So, yeah, that was very moving for me. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it is very relevant because so much of the reality we have been fed is curated, and so much of the ground that we do stand on is tainted. And I think that there's a moment, and I'm sure that there's different moments. Like I said, it wasn't the first time that I realized this, but for me, this research grief, this time when I was, I had started off wanting to, so excited and wanting to learn about my people and learn about Christianity as it intersects, with the Cuban people. And of course, that wasn't an exciting moment. That's when it really became personal. Of course, I knew about colonization and I knew about these things. But it really, it hit me for the first time, like, wait a minute, this is my history. These are my people. And I remember the first thing I picked up, and I write about this in the book, but was Miguel de la Torre's book he's Cuban as well. And the first words, sorry.
Oh, I just said incredible author. Sorry.
Right. Yeah. No, he is.
Yeah.
And the first words that it said, like women were raped and children were disemboweled, and men fell predator to the invader's sword. And I just remember, like, it hit me like this is the introduction that we have to Christianity. That my people had to Christianity. So what do we do with that, right? Like, how do we make sense of this? How do we deal with generational grief and generational trauma? And I think what's so hard is that so much of history has been whitewashed, and so much of, again, what we know has been curated, that in many ways my family is not even connected to that, right? It's just something so much in the past that I feel like I'm even having to dig through walls and walls and walls of trauma, and walls and walls and walls of just walls, right? Of unmet and unworked through grief and trauma. And I think that's what was really hard for me, is digging through this and realizing, wow, there's so much that my family, hasn't even dealt with.
Right.
There's so much that I haven't even really dealt with and really worked through. And that's where sort of that aspect of the journey began. And I think that actually in my podcast, I just had a conversation with a woman, and she's Korean American, and she is a transnational adoptee. And so we were talking about adoption and adoption language in scripture. And one of the phrases that she uses is coming out of the fog. And I thought that was so powerful, because so many of us, I feel like in different ways and in different aspects, are coming out of the fog, right? Whether it's the fog of white supremacy, or understanding, really the depth of systemic racism, or the depth of colonization, because we know these things, right? But I think in different aspects we realize how deep. Oh wait, it's deeper. Oh no, it's deeper. Oh my goodness, it's deeper. And it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. And so there's a lot of excavating, and like I mentioned, being our own archaeologists and digging up these bones and these skeletons and just facing them, right? And where is God in that? As Christians, like, how do we wrestle with the divine in that? I talk a lot about decolonization. I mention it in my book. And there's something, one of my favorite decolonial or post-colonial scholars, his name is Walter Mignolo. He teaches at Duke Divinity, or at Duke, not Divinity, just at Duke University. And one of the things that he says that I think has been very helpful for me as it relates to this and Christianity is that he says, you can't decolonize something that is inherently colonial, right? So you can't really decolonize US America, right? Like, it's inherently colonial. You can't really decolonize the academy because it's inherently colonial. But, and he doesn't say this, but this is where I made the connection, but you can decolonize Christianity because Christianity isn't inherently colonial. Maybe white evangelicalism, or maybe aspects or denominations or whatever. But man, the movement of Jesus is not a colonial movement. And there's so much freedom in that. And so I think that's what I'm trying to, in my book, I talk about, Jesus of los humildes, of the humble. So how do we, wrestle with this Jesus and peel away the layers of, whether it's curated realities or tainted, and peel away these layers so that we can sort of meet this Jesus of los humildes. And it's just a journey and a process, and there's so much digging to do, and it almost feels exhausting, but you have to keep digging, and there's freedom there too. I think. So.
And I think it's critical for both, as you point out in that quote at the beginning, for colonizer and the colonized.
Right.
So as a descendant of settlers in this country, a part of coming to grips with the tainted soil that we're discovering and the narrative that we've been fed,
right.
It is exhausting. Not nearly as exhausting as it is for those who've been colonized and for whom this is trauma and all that stuff. But somehow or another, I think what I like about your book is it does point to the gospel, right? Like, it points to the life and witness of Jesus. It points to the notion that we follow in the footsteps of this peasant Jewish cynic who was decolonial, like he was anti-empire, right? Like,
Right.
you know, we're
Exactly.
following in the footsteps of one who professed a way that said, no, the empire and the ways of violence and
Right.
domination are not the way to live. And so we do belong to an outfit that can be saved. We talk
Right.
about salvation in the church, you know,
Mhm.
and that's what makes words of like those of your own so critically prophetic and important in a time like this. So yeah, I agree 100. But I just think that
Thank you.
I think it's important for us who are settler descendants to know that this is work we need to be engaged in.
Right,
Right.
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 I wanted to ask you about one of the striking stories in your book that I really resonated with me. You were experience in which you talk about truth telling and the importance of truth telling. And you told the story about your experience of talking to a women's group at one of the first churches you attended when you were in seminary. And you talk about that relationship to the story of Hannah.
Mm.
And for someone that's preached on Hannah and heard countless sermons about Hannah, I really found this a wonderful viewpoint to understand. And I'm wondering if you could share that story of that time at the church and your biblical reflections about Hannah and Eli.
Yeah. Yeah. Hannah's story, I think, I was really, as I was studying it and kind of writing about it, I was so fascinated by that notion of truth telling, like how she is, she stands up for herself and she advocates for
Mm,
herself and she says no, to her husband and to the priest and to, these so-called characters of spiritual authority, right? And she, sort of shows this spiritual authority that, it's kind of overlooked, right? Like we just think, oh, she was a woman of faith, or oh,
yeah.
she, all these things. But no, I think there's so much power in her story. And yeah, and I think that that like I wrote in the book that her story energizes me as someone who, yeah, I mean, dealing in as being a woman and a non-culturally white woman, and being in spaces where my culture isn't really understood, who I am isn't really understood. People didn't know what to do with me in seminary. They were like, a deer in headlights because I had an opinion, or because I was loud and passionate or whatever. But yeah, and so it was just this really interesting, as I sort of made this connection. I just to kind of give a little bit background of that story, but I had just joined this church, and I had been at that time really trained, or however you want to call it, in this form of discipleship where you kind of get together with a small group of women,
Cell
and
ministry.
right, right,
Right.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
yeah.
Cell ministry.
Um, yeah, so I thought, oh, this is, there was these young women and they wanted to connect, and I thought, oh, this would be cool. So we started getting together and we started reading the Bible together, I mean, it wasn't anything, so like we just read the Bible and ate together, right? But the pastor found out and all of a sudden was asking questions about me and labeled me suspect, because I was new to the church, and I guess maybe he wasn't used to women just sort of taking this sort of initiative. I don't know. And it was a very hard time for me. I just remember thinking like, what in the world, and
Yeah.
saying that I was unsubmissive and I didn't ask for permission. And it was just a very hard, and I remember that was sort of what led to me leaving just the denomination and just
Mhm.
Yeah.
like, it was a
Yeah.
very big moment. But I just remember, in that moment, just the idea of spiritual authority and how that can be so used and abused. And when it's tied up to with patriarchy, and when it's tied up with, racism or ethno-racism, when it's tied up
Mhm.
with all of these things, it can be so obviously harmful and
Yeah.
so hurtful. And
Yeah.
it was like this pastor was more concerned with controlling his congregation than he was with his congregation like reading the Bible together, right? Like it was just so silly.
Yeah.
But back then it didn't feel silly, right? It felt really hurtful and all those things. But yeah, but then reflecting on Hannah's story and like, wait a minute, this is a story as old as time. Like,
Yeah.
this has been happening for so long, that a woman who, like Hannah, and I love, as I was doing the research, just so many women and women of color who sort of exegete her story, how they were pointing out these little details of like, well, her husband is usually like, he loves her, right? We have like this narrative of like, he was such a good husband, he loved her so much, but there
Mhm.
was no space, like when, he doesn't give her space to like say certain things, or he asks her questions that make no sense, like, don't you love me more, which is like a form of like emotional abuse, like all of these things that we miss. Thank God for movements like Me Too and things like that we can kind of see, oh, wait a minute, like that is abusive, but yeah, and I just kind of picking out the conversations that she's having, and how she interacts and relates to God, and then how God blesses her in her truth telling, and in her standing up to the priest and saying, no, I'm not drunk,
Yes, yeah.
which I think is just so powerful.
Right,
So,
Yeah.
That's awesome.
You read-
Sorry, Ian, but did just to remember from that story, the pastor went to your husband and not to you, or your boyfriend?
Oh
at the time?
yeah,
Yeah.
That was another
Yeah.
aspect of it.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
asked my husband
Yeah,
out to lunch, and he literally asked my husband, so what's Kat's sin? And my husband was like, sin, he's like, why don't
It's
you
like-
ask her,
Yeah.
because he was trying to get, understand and see where, like, what, like I said, he labeled me suspect. So I was trying to see, like, what was I, what ulterior motive did I have? And I didn't. I just wanted to read the Bible with the women,
you need to mail him this book, Kat.
Yeah, send him a copy of the book.
Send him that. Remember me? Read
we
this.
literally always joke about that we're gonna do that. I don't know.
Ask him if he'll sign it for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Sorry,
that's really
Ian.
funny.
Ian's got a profound
Ian.
question
No,
too. I'm sorry.
it's totally okay. No, that added thing was just so good. You write about protest and I don't really know what this word is.
Persistence.
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 Wow,
Persistence.
I can't read for some reason.
Ian's just finishing up grade 6.
Yeah, I was held back
That's so funny.
several years.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So you write about protest and persistence. Specifically, you write about the experience in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And reflecting on that, you write about Rizpah from 2 Samuel. I have no idea who that is. It's not someone that I would learn about
Right.
from anything, really. So
there was a felt Rizbah at one point.
there
in
was a
Sunday
felt
school.
one,
There was a
probably.
felt
Maybe.
one.
Maybe.
And she went on the board.
I don't think I didn't get her in my Sunday school class.
Didn't you?
So can you share with our listeners your reflection on her and why her story resonates with you and with the given and with why it resonates with you, and given the way that bodies of Black, Indigenous, and people of color and women of color have been objectified and eroticized for centuries.
Yeah.
Which is it?
No, thank you for that question. And yes, I felt the same way about Rizpah as well. I sort of discovered her, and I had already been in seminary for several years, and I'm like, why haven't I ever heard of her?
I'll name my daughter Rizpah.
Yeah, no, really. But yeah, and I was so surprised by that, because if you read her story, and I'll share a little bit, more
Please
details
tell
about her
people
story.
about Rizpah.
Yeah. Well, I think what stood out to me specifically was the fact that although her story is overlooked, it literally changes the course of history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll explain now. So Rizpah she was Saul's concubine, and she, which is just sort of like a mistress, I guess you can say. And Saul has died, and at this time there's a famine going on in Israel, and David is king. And he inquires of the Lord, like, why is there a famine? And the Lord says, well, there's been some sort of like unjust whatever with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites are upset, and blood needs to be avenged, and you need to, kind of right this wrong. So then David goes to the Gibeonites and says, okay, what do you guys, like, how can we make this right? And they're like, all right, well, we need to kill, certain people from your household in order to whatever for our household, like an eye for an eye type of thing. So they kill Rizpah's sons. And I think that what is so, and her story's short, she shows up and it's a couple verses, but her sons are murdered and their bodies are just left to rot, and it's this unjust murder. And we know that in ancient Israel, there needed to be proper burial practices, right? When someone was killed, or, when there was a dead body. But because it didn't matter, David didn't care. He sort of let their bodies to rot. And Rizpah, for 6 months, the Bible says, she puts her body on the line and she fights off the wild animals and the vultures just so that their bodies would be preserved, so that they wouldn't be even more defiled, right, by the animals eating them. And she sits there and it says that she puts on mourning clothes and she holds like this vigil, and it's an act of protest, as many have pointed out. Like, she is protesting the unjust murders and the unjust, the non-burial of her sons. And what I think is fascinating, this is going back to what I was saying, is that, she's doing this for 6 months. David notices, and David's kind of like, hey, what's up here? And he says, yeah. And he's like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll bury it. He kind of rights some wrongs. And that's when God sent rain. And I think that it's fascinating because after 3 years of famine, and the people are struggling, and the people are hungry, and the people are thirsty, and Rizpah puts her body on the line, she protests, she does what's deeply right. And God says, that's what I needed. That's what I wanted to see, justice. I wanted to see justice. And God sends rain. And why don't we know about that story? You know what I mean? Like, that story is so untold. But it's so important because it says so much. It says so much about God's heart. It says so much, about the audacity of this woman and how God listens and God pays attention. And it's an overlooked story in the Bible, and people don't even talk about her. But I think she is one of my favorite characters in Scripture, of how she demands justice. She protests, at her son's corpses. And I just thought so much of, I'm writing this book in the middle of the George Floyd protests, which is a whole thing, and I'm thinking, I literally was wrestling with, like, how do we connect to this idea of an abuelita faith, to what's happening in the world, because I know it's relevant, but, and so as I'm wrestling with this and I'm thinking about all of the mothers who have had to bury their sons, because of unjust situations and unjust murders and police brutality and all of these things, and I'm thinking about Rizpah and how, the tenacity and the audacity and the resistance and the persistence of mothers, who protest and put their bodies on the line. And I thought so much, about the mothers in history, and then her, and I think her story needs to be told.
I was when I was reading some of that, I was wondering to myself aloud, I thought, I wonder if Jesus had her in mind when he was telling the parable of the widow, the woman going to the unjust judge, right? And she kept saying, "Give me justice, give me justice, give me justice," and he finally did. And I wonder if he,
that's beautiful,
was thinking of her, and we could see that connection definitely.
Kevin,
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Kevin, which guest said the quote about when a husband's wife dies, they're called a widower when or something like that, and we don't have a name for when someone's child dies or something like that, because it's so
I think it was actually the parishioners of Rob's, geez, I'm just losing their names now, but they got the beautiful little child. No, that's not who it was. I can't think who it was, Ian. But you're right. Somebody did say to us that,
somebody said that somewhere.
That we have easy names for things like, it may have been John Davidson. I don't know. No, you know who it was? It was Ken Eastwood, our radio friend, because Ken lost his son, and he was talking about it. We have names for, you lose your wife, you lose your husband, but you lose your child. There's no name to define.
There's no name. Yeah. So true. So true. So, Kat, just to finish up, one more thing I wanted to ask you about the work. We know the work for justice, for right relationship, for dignity, for all human beings is a work which is ongoing, and it's work that demands our constant attention every day. And you're right about continuing to work towards resolution, even in the midst of the struggles that we're going through. And it's really the work of survival, people getting what they need, not for long term, as you remind your readers, but for the day at hand, like in the Lord's Prayer, when we pray for our daily bread. And you're right, the struggle to survive is not an individual or isolated test, but a communal experience that involves all people, particularly those in the community. So I wonder if you could say more about this and more about another Spanish word.
Here we go. Everybody get ready. Here he goes.
Resolviendo.
Resolviendo. Very good. Yes.
Why weren't you rolling your R, Rob?
Resolviendo.
Oh, wow. Perfect.
That's better. Okay, this has been another episode of White Guy Tries to Say Spanish.
Yeah, failing miserably.
Yeah.
So funny. No, that was great. Yeah, resolviendo. So that's a word. As I was doing actually research on Cuba, it's a word that's used to describe the situation of many folks on the island, of how they're just trying to figure it out, right? They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to get their next meal. That there isn't any, you have no capacity to think about the future because you're so focused on the present. And I realized, that is the reality of most peoples of the world, right? We're just trying to resolver. We're just trying to, we're resolviendo and we're trying to resolver. And, obviously marginalized people, those of us with privilege, we don't necessarily have to worry about, what we're going to eat or how we're going to, what are we going to do with the $3 that we have for the day. Right. And so I was really taken by this because of the idea that, again, a lot of women in the Bible are resolviendo. A lot of, people in scripture are just trying to figure it out, and then it's this idea of figuring it out. But we do that in community and we do that together. And I think that when we're attuned, to those in our midst, to those around us, when we're attuned, when we're in proximity, we realize and we can recognize that resolviendo, that trying to just figuring it out day by day, the Lord's Prayer is a sacred, as I mentioned, is a sacred and holy endeavor, right? And I think, again, the reason why I thought so much of the Lord's Prayer, because that's what Jesus, I believe, is praying that to the majority of the world, or not praying that too, but is giving that as an example to the majority of the world, your daily bread, what you need for today. And, we spiritualize it. I don't think, we love to over spiritualize so much of what Jesus says, but I think he literally means it in a lot of ways. People just need their daily bread. And so, so that's something that as I was connecting it, I realized man, this is the struggle. This is it. This is I talk about la lucha, the struggle of everyday life, and how that struggle is holy and God is present and God is there and God sees it. And, and that isn't something, we don't have to put too much language about it or too much, we don't have to overspirit, it is what it is. And I think that there's power in recognizing that. And there's power in when we're in proximity to resolver with others.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right. Yeah. And when it brings us into that present need and moment, we're also available and open to seeing the need of that person in front of us. Right.
Right.
That we're not, they have needs in that moment too. And it could just be that conversation or that leg up or whatever it is, to see them and hear them in that moment, love them.
Exactly.
And that's so important for us to not get too ahead of ourselves and, like you say, over spiritualize things, but to see that need and meet that need. We can do that. We can do that.
Yes.
Kat, what an absolute joy to have you today. Thank you so much.
No, thank you guys.
Again, there's the book. All right. Available August 10th. And I look forward to hearing more about this as we move forward. And we wish you all the best. And thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been so fun. Thank you guys for engaging with my book. And I
love the book. Love the book.
Thank you.
Can you do one favor for me though? Would you go down to Broadway and
Broadway here in Nashville?
Yes, in Nashville. Yeah. Go down to Broadway, get a nice margarita.
Well, I'm actually pregnant right now. I've been actually
don't have the margarita.
Don't
have the margarita. No margaritas then. Just go and listen to some fine music.
Right. I was telling my husband, I'm like, that's the first thing I'm going to do when I have this child is just get down there and have a drink.
Yeah. It's supersize it. After
it's an incredible strip. We were down there a few years ago for my wife, her cousin got married. She lives in Nashville actually. And so we were down there and it was my first time. And wow, it was a beautiful spot. Yeah. Lots of stuff to learn there. Great place to people watch.
Yes.
Just saying.
I'll do that. Yeah.
Kat Armas is our guest today. Kat, and again, Abuelita Faith, what women on the margins teach us about wisdom, persistence, and strength.
Thank you very much, Kat.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to Kat again, and appreciate her time. And again, if you want to find out a little bit more about her book or other books that we've highlighted here in Authors on the Vickers Crossing podcast, go to thevicarscrossing.com. and you will be able to click books, and see some information on some of those past authors, including Kat's book, which comes out August 10th. All right, guys, great. That's good. I'm glad we could be together today. And again, thanks to our sponsors, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George from St. Aidan's Church.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!